recording. So thank you so much for joining us today for the third WEPs Deep Dive series session of 2024. My name is Miwa Park, and I am the WEPs coordinator at Women's Empowerment Principles Secretariat at UN Women. In today's webinar, we are zooming in on transparency and accountability. Within that, we decided to hear from European Union legislations and reporting requirements with gender lens. Though you're not based in or nor operating in EU, we hope today's session can make you understand some of the dynamics of the public and private sector when it comes to advancing gender equality in the corporate world. So let me go over today's agenda. So first, some introductory remarks from NFL, head of WEPs Global Secretariat at UN Women. Then we will invite speakers from European Parliament with their presentation, followed by a roundtable panel session with them, and from S&P Global, a WEPs signatory. We have two distinguished speakers from European Parliament today with us. Elodie Carmona, she's head of the unit. It's a very long name, so I'm going to try. Directorate General for Internal Policies of the Union, Directorate of Citizens' Rights and Constitutional Affairs, Policy Department for Citizens' Rights and Constitutional Affairs from European Parliament. And from same department, we have Andreea Chifan. She's Parliamentary Research Administrator who's joining with Elodie today. Then we have Alyson Genovese with us today. She is Senior Director, Global Head of Corporate Responsibility at S&P Global. She leads S&P Global's corporate responsibility implementation, including the company's ESG approach, performance, reporting, and enterprise-wide integration. We thank all the speakers for their time today and looking forward to listening to all soon. Then I'll continue with my logistical reminders of the day. Please feel free to write your questions to the panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen throughout the webinar. If you'd like to communicate with other participants, as you're doing right now, please use the chat function. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A session or throughout the chat, throughout the Q&A function anytime. We will answer these. And also, I remind you that this webinar is being recorded and later will be uploaded to weps.org website to share with the general public. Lastly, we will have a very short evaluation survey that will pop up when you're leaving today's webinar. So please take some time to answer it. So we do take a look at those results to improve our future contents and more. Now to get us started, I'd like to invite Anna to deliver her opening remarks. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and welcome everyone, and welcome particularly to our speakers today. In preparation for this session, I actually did a Google search. Why should a company report on gender equality? And you have to really search hard to find any answer to that. There's a lot on why gender equality matters and why gender equality matters both for the constituency, but also for the revenue of the company, the profitability of the company, etc. But hardly nothing about what we should report. So I'd like to address some of these elements today. And before we get started on the different views from two perspectives today, and we're actually organizing this webinar because we heard from you. We heard that you are grappling a little bit with the sustainability reporting. There's a lot out there. Some companies actually establishing roots in the European Union because they want to be there and hear what's happening on the ground. There's a lot that it's not only applicable to European companies, but companies that are doing business in the European Union. So we thought that this was very important to invite our dear colleagues, Elodie and Andreea today from the European Parliament to talk a little bit about the background and how this came about and what impact does it have on the European market and beyond. And we'll also hear from Alyson from S&P, which I think many of you or most of you are familiar with, and what perspective they are taking on this. But basically, if you look at it from a stakeholder perspective, why should we report on gender equality? Of course, there is this legislation that is growing in many regions and parts of the country, parts of the world. And I mean, I think in India, and those that are joining from India can maybe correct me, but I've heard that if you have 10 employees as a company, you need to report on what measures you're taking to address sexual harassment, for example. And then you have other countries that are giving incentives to companies that are reporting. And those incentives may be, oh, you will have a priority in our purchasing, in procurement. So the government procurement might give preference to those companies that are making progress on gender equality and are reporting. But apart from these regulatory elements, there are also a lot of stakeholders out there, consumers. And I can just give you a little story of myself. I was looking for a gift for a friend's daughter, and I came across this web signatory, and they reported on their website that 100% of their suppliers are web signatories. So this matters for women, young women, older women, and consumers. When they make decisions, do I buy from this company or do I buy from the other company? So these are the messages that are very important. It's also very important for investors. So investors that are looking into investing, whether they're institutional investors or they're private investors, they would like to know what are the risks in investing in this company. So they want to know what is this company potentially doing on gender equality, and what are the risks if they're not doing anything. We also know that talent are spending much more time, if they're looking for a new job, to know that the values are aligning with that of the company. So the more they can find about the company and what they are doing to advance gender equality, the more they will be drawn to these companies. And finally, we hear also a lot, many of our signatories are coming because the business partners have told them that if you want to be a partner, you need to commit to gender equality and you need to work on gender equality. So there are many, if you look at all of these stakeholders, that actually have a say beyond the legislation. So legislation is key to make it a streamlined and equal game for everyone. But there are a lot of constituents that are looking at companies today. And from our perspective, from the Web Secretariat perspective, we have, as you may know, 8 indicators that we have identified. We've been trying to make it as global as possible so that it fits all the companies of no matter the size and the country and the industry. So at the moment, our reporting indicators are focused primarily on the workplace. But we are also working to see what would be the indicators that could be applicable to most of you when it comes to marketplace and also to the community. And just as a quick reminder before I hand it over back to Miwa to introduce our speakers, I would like to remind us of these 8 indicators because they're very important. The first 7 ones are, as we see, almost as the outcome indicators. They are quantitative indicators, but these are the results of many of the policies that you're putting in place. So the percentage of women and men employees, that shows how attractive the company is to both women and men and who are the ones choosing to go for the company. The percentage of women and men in senior management positions and on board is also the measures that the company is taking. What is the pipeline that the company is working on, depending on if it's a publicly listed company or a private? These are the different pipelines that are showing the efforts of the company. Then we have also the ratio of women and men salaries, which talks about the gender pay gap, but also to see what are the intentions of the company. So maybe that the current percentage of women and men are very low, but the percentage of newly hired employees are showing an indication in the direction of the company, but also the percentage of promotion and career opportunities for women and men in the company. And finally, the last quantitative indicator is the retention rate of women and men after taking parental leave, because that's also where we see the leaky pipeline, if you wish, to use that term. But that's where if the provision of the company is strong enough, not strong enough to help women stay in the company after having had a child, or men for that matter, that's then an issue and an indication that there is not too much effort to help parents balance work and life responsibilities. And the final one, which is a little bit difficult to make as a quantitative indicator, is actually a company, if the company, so it's a yes or no question, if the company has a confidential, anonymous, grievance resolution, reporting, and non-retaliation mechanism and procedure for addressing and responding to incidents of violence and harassment. So it is very important, and we have put it there, but we know that nobody would report to us on how many incident they had. So this is, do you have the mechanism and the procedure in place? So that is what we encourage all of you to do, no matter the legislation, to report on this. But I think it's time to now hand over to our experts, Elodie and Andreea, and then we'll hear from Alyson. Miwa, do you want to say something else before we hand it over to Elodie and Andreea?
No.
Okay, so we'll just hand it over for you to present a little bit more about what the European Union regulations are about. Over to you.
Thank you. So we will first present in a nutshell the European legislative procedure, because some of you are not familiar with it. And then we will also give a quick overview of the most recent legislation on gender equality, which has provisions on reporting obligations. Then Andreea will present companies' reporting obligation under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I will finish with a similar presentation, but on the newly adopted Pay Transparency Directive. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, I hope you can see clearly my infographic. Anyway, I will present it. So we have a very unique legislative decision system in the European Union. So the European Commission, which is a big administration led by a college of 27 commissioners, which are politicians appointed by each member state, each of the 27 member states. So this big administration prepares legislative proposals, which are endorsed then by the College of Commissioners at political level, and then referred to the two co-legislators. One of the co-legislators being the Council of the European Union, which is composed of representatives of the governments of the 27 member states, and they are accompanied by the full army of administrative staff to support them in their analysis of these legislative proposals. And the other co-legislator is the European Parliament, which is made of 705 members. And for the next elections, it will be, so in June in June of this year, it will be 720, following the Brexit and the latest decisions on the allocation of seats. So for the time being, it's 705 members of the European Parliament elected directly in the 27 member states every 5 years by citizens. So you have a minimum of 6 members for the smallest countries, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Malta. And the biggest number currently is for Germany with 96 members. So the allocation of seats is proportional to the size of the country. Similarly, in the Council, the power is also linked, the decision power is linked to the size of the country with a complex mechanism. So once the proposal is referred to the two co-legislators, each one starts working on it in their different structure. So in the Parliament, we have 22 topical committees, one important committee for legislative proposals on gender equality is the FAM committee, so it's a committee on women's rights. but it usually works jointly with other committees, for instance, the Employment Committee, which is in charge of all employment-related issues. And they have similar structure in the Council, and both institutions, after complex internal negotiations, reach their own position. So for the Council, it's called a general approach, and for the Parliament, it's called the negotiation mandate. So it's their position on the proposal of the Commission. Then the representative of the two institutions meet, and with the technical support of the Commission, then negotiate further. And usually it's a long and complex process because the representative of the Council has to come back to member states to check what is the room for maneuver, what kind of compromise they can accept. And it's a bit the same for representative of the Parliament, where they have to come back to their respective political groups and to check what is acceptable in terms of compromise or not. The whole exercise is about making acceptable compromise for everyone. At the end of this process, which on average lasts from the submission of the proposal to the agreement reached during these negotiation rounds, which are called trilogues, the average duration is 19 to 20 months. And at the end, the two co-legislators reach an agreement, which is further endorsed by the Council as a whole, so ministers of all the member states, and the Parliament in plenary. And once endorsed and agreed by the two institutions, it's published in the official journal of the European Union, and then it is a directive or a regulation. The big difference between the both is that the regulation is directly applicable, while the directive gives goals to member states, and then they have a kind of freedom to implement these goals. So they have more freedom with the directive than with the regulation. So next slide, please. So yes, I just wanted to give you the complexity of the procedure, because it also explains a little bit sometimes the content of our legislation. It was to mention that for the first time ever, the current commission, so elected in 2019, and the term is ending this June, is led by a woman, Ursula von der Leyen, and Commissioner for Equality was appointed by Ursula von der Leyen for the first time ever under this commission. It's a Maltese commissioner, so this commissioner was appointed by Malta. It's a professional politician, and her name is Elena Dalli, and her whole work is about promoting gender equality in Europe. Equality in general, so not only gender equality, but gender equality is one important component of equality, of course. So under the impetus of Ms. Dalli and Ms. von der Leyen, a gender equality strategy for 2020 to 2025 has been issued on several aspects of gender equality, so gender-based violence, work-life balance, and also pay transparency. And most of the legislation you can see on your screen actually come within this gender equality strategy. So you have the Women on Board Directive, very important, Work-Life Balance Directive, which was a bit anticipating the gender equality strategy. You have the Minimum Wage Directive, and the two directives we will discuss more in depth, the CSRD and the Pay Transparency. It has to be noted that all these directives have provisions on reporting, but in most cases, the reporting is for member states. But in the case of CSRD and Pay Transparency, the reporting is also on employers. So that's also something which is very specific and very interesting. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you. So now I guess it's my part to continue. So as Elodie already mentioned, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it's a rather new instrument adopted in 2022 with very comprehensive reporting requirements for undertakings in Europe. It is actually a revision for those of you a bit more familiar, it's a revision of the non-financial reporting directive which is from 2014, which already had requirements with respect to reporting on sustainability issues in general, and more particularly going on social issues like those which would concern us today. The CSRD, so this new directive on sustainability reporting, as I said, adopted in 2022, in force since January 2023. And it needs to be fully transposed in 2024. That means that, as Elodie already mentioned, yeah, sorry, I didn't say that. I needed the next slide. As Elodie mentioned, it's a directive, which means that it's an instrument which needs to be transposed at national level by each member state. They have, let's say, certain margins of maneuvers, but they have to meet the goals established by the Commission and eventually decided on by the two co-legislators. And most importantly, it's complemented by the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which have been more recently adopted, where actually we find all the obligations for the undertakings with respect to this sustainability reporting. Now, where this next slide, sorry, where this how come the Commission decided that we need a new non-financial reporting instrument? It seems it has been announced already in 2019 in this package called the European Green Deal, where the Commission commits to the green standards. And with respect to the objective of the directive is to provide the public, both the civil, let's say the civil society, the government, but also other companies, with adequate publicly available information about both the impact that these companies or the undertakings would have on the environment or social or on the social on the people, let's say, sorry, that they would have, but also how these requirements are going to impact their activities. Next slide, please. Yes. So leaving from the non-financial reporting directive from 2014, why also other changes required a new reporting directive. There have been subsequent policy developments. We have the UN Sustainable Goals, which have been adopted in 2015, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2016, the Green Deal, which I mentioned, and one maybe it's interesting to say also that before the adoption of the directive, the Commission, or actually on any legislative instrument, always does an impact assessment, which is pretty comprehensive, and the documentation it's available online. And there they actually identify the problems of the directive from 2014, actually, that there is lack of adequate information on non-financial issues. And from the perspective of the so-called preparer, the preparers are actually the companies, is that for them, actually, it was more costful and more resources were needed in order to comply with different standards. And now they are all put together. Next slide, please. So yeah, next slide. Sorry, thank you. With respect to the applicability, which companies are going to be affected by it? So as opposed to 2014, where we had 11,000 companies which needed to comply with this kind of reporting, now we have almost 50,000 companies in the EU. And as you have seen there, as you can see there, we have large companies, listed companies. I'm not going to read everything, and also non-EU companies, which is of interest for some of you, maybe. Next slide, please. How is the reporting going to be done? This is dealt with through these European sustainability reporting standards, which are extremely detailed, very comprehensive, adopted in their turn by a delegated regulation, which is a different type of regulation, let's say, which kind of gives the Commission the possibility to explain a bit what it's meant through the main legislative instrument. The Commission consulted the advisory body, which is called the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, in order to draft this reporting standard. It's applicable from 1st of January 2024, and very important, it's mandatory for the companies which are obliged under the Accounting Directive, which is another instrument, to report certain sustainability information. Just like a little parenthesis, of course, there are several layers of instruments, but they all meet eventually in the standards. Next slide, please. With respect to the timetable, it's pretty complex. It depends on the size of the company. I think it's maybe, for the sake of time, I don't read everything there. You can see it yourself. But suffice to say that for the smaller the company, the longer the time for them to comply with these requirements. Next slide, please. And in addition, for non-EU companies, there will be some separate, which let's say generate over 150 million euros per year, and they have a certain branch in the EU. Then they will have to report as from 2028, with the first sustainability statement in 2029. But there will be separate standards, so it's good to keep an eye on these issues. Next slide, please. Now the standards, exactly, because I kept on repeating reporting standards. Which are they? They are 12 in total. 2 are cross-cutting. Please go further. Okay, we have 5 environmental standards. Again, pretty comprehensive with respect to environmental reporting. Next slide, please. 4 social standards, and here we are getting closer to what is of interest for us, because we have reporting standards on own workforce, workers in the value chain. These are actually individuals which are not covered by an employment contract. They can be upstream or downstream in the value chain. So they can be subcontractors, let's say. Thank you. Affected communities, and consumers and end users, and there is one governance reporting standard with respect to business conduct. Next slide, please. Now, talking about reporting obligations from a gender perspective. In the social standard number 2, there is, as general disclosure, there is a disclosure requirement called the role of the administrative management and supervisory body. So actually the objective is for the undertaking to provide information on the composition and diversity of the administrative management and supervisory body. So they will have to disclose the percentage by gender and other aspects, I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous, of diversity that the undertaking considers. And there I have a little note. The board's gender diversity shall be calculated on an average, and there actually it's a reference to another reporting indicator in EU legislation. So as comprehensive that these standards, new standards are, they always are correlated with other existing standards, and they always send to them. So it's actually pretty comprehensive to work with them. It's a bit detailed, but it goes, from one step to the other. Next slide, please. If we go to the social standard 1, own workforce, and the second one, which is workers in the value chain, we see that the subtopics of reporting refer to issues of interest for us: equal treatment and opportunities, gender equality, diversity. If we go further, please. as an example, so the standards also require an explanation on how the impacts considered are presented. And so, for example, on the matter of equal opportunities, discrimination, hiring, and promotion against women, it is a risk because it reduces the company's access to a certain pool of qualified labor, and it also harms its reputation. And this is a connection with what Anna was saying in her introductory remarks. Conversely, it can be actually very positive because the company has access to a wider pool of expertise, and it improves the undertaking reputation. Next slide, please. Policies related to own or workforce. So the undertaking has to present all the time, if they have policies in place, to prevent, mitigate, and act upon issues like discrimination. And I have put there on the slide a bit more details about it. But that's the idea. They have to explain how they approach this kind of situation. Next slide, please. If we get to metrics and targets, so disclosure requirements on diversity metrics, and we have their gender distribution and at top management. With respect to work-life balance metrics, the percentage of the entitled employees to have family-related leave, and a breakdown by gender. With respect to remuneration metrics, the pay gap and total the percentage also gap in pay between male and female. And also then there is an explanation with respect to the gender ratio, to the ratio between the remuneration and so on. So as I said, it's pretty detailed. And if we go to the next slide, again, another requirement, it's about incidents, complaints, and severe human rights impacts. Exactly, again, making the connection with what Anna was saying in the beginning. Under these standards and under this directive, companies actually have to report on this kind of course, with respecting the privacy regulations, this kind of incidents, and the policies that it exists in place to address them. But they have to report the total number of incidents of discrimination, including harassment, reported in the reporting period. This is just an example. I focused on the social standard number 1. It goes similarly for the workers in the value chain. It was a bit just to highlight the level of detail that EU and the Commission went at this point in time with reporting with a gender lens, non-financial reporting. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Yes. So I hope you can see my slide because it's a bit dense. Actually, I will now present the reporting obligation under the Pay Transparency Directive. It was adopted quite recently, so it's really a new thing. So first, a little background on the directive. So equal pay for equal work is one of European founding principles. So it's enshrined in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and it is a European right since 1958. Yet, in practice, implementation is challenging. Lack of pay transparency is, for instance, one of the key obstacles to reducing the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap means in Europe that women, on average, earn 13% less than men per hours. So this is a data from Eurostat in 2021. This pay gap has a very important impact and long-term impact on the quality of life of women, the risk of exposure to poverty, of course, and on the pension pay gap, which is huge in European Union, 30% in 2023. Of course, the gender pay gap is worsened by the lack of pay transparency, by pay secrecy, because then pay discrimination often goes undetected, and women face difficulties to address them and to make claim for redress, and that's just to reduce the gender pay gap. So it's really important to tackle, and it's quite easy because some factors for the gender pay gap are more difficult to address. This factor, discrimination, is something which is more easy to address by the legislator than, for instance, the fact that most of the workforce in low-paid jobs are women. This can be changed, but it takes time, it's difficult, and legislation is usually powerless. But addressing discrimination is something that the legislator can easily try. And for that, you need to have a good enforcement and a good sanction mechanism. We'll see that later. So a little bit of timeline. In March 2021, as I mentioned before, in the context of the Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025, under the impulse of two women in the European Commission, the President von der Leyen and the Commissioner Helena Dalli, the European Commission adopted the legislative proposal, which focuses on better access, so better information, of course, and better access to justice for victims. Then I presented before as a legislative process so that you can follow this. The Council and Parliament worked, so two co-legislators work on this proposal. The Council adopted its general approach in December 2021, and the Parliament took a bit more time because it adopted its negotiation mandate in April 2022 after only 5 trilogues, which is quite a few for this kind of ambitious legislation. In December 22, so after 5 trilogues, an agreement was reached. It was subsequently endorsed by the two co-legislators in March and April 2023. The directive has been published in the official journal in May 2023, and it has to be transposed in national law by member states at the latest by the 7th of June 2026. So there is a little bit of time, but as we can discuss, actually not so much time. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will briefly describe the scope. So the scope is the employers in the private and public sector in the European Union. All workers who have an employment contract or relationship as defined by the law, collective agreement, or practice in force in member states. And for that, to define this kind of relationship, we have to take into account the case law of the Court of Justice because it's a complex topic here in the European Union, and which is very important. Certain aspects also apply to job applicants in the provision of Article 5. So it's also something very important, as we will see in the next slide. Yes, so the main provisions are in Article 5 to 7 and 14 to 26. So access to information is in those articles, so-called Chapter 2, Article 5 to 7. So there is an obligation for employers to inform job seekers about the starting salary or pay range of the advertised position. It should be done ahead of the interview. So I mean, it can be done in the vacancy notice, for instance, and the employer cannot ask candidates about their pay history. So there is this end of this secrecy, a bit opaque, obscure salary negotiation during job interviews. Yes. So that's, yes, and also, yes, we'll see later something else. And once they are in the job, workers have the right to ask the employer information about average pay levels broken down by sex, category of employees doing the same work or work in equal value, and criteria used to determine pay and career progression, which must be objective and gender neutral. Workers have the right to get information about also the individual level and how it fits with the other pay level of workers for the same category in the company. The second big chapter, no, sorry, can you go up? Yes, the second big chapter is Article 14 to 26, is access to justice. So it's really important. So access to information. Okay, I'm finishing. Access to information is key then for employers to have access to negotiate and then to be aware where they stand compared to others. But access to justice is also very important. So there is individual compensation for victims of discrimination, and the burden of proof is on the employers, which is something extremely new in Europe. And also member states can decide on can apply effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties, which are decided by them. Usually, the turnover is a percentage of the turnover of the company. It's not specified in the directive, but it's up to the member states. But as per the directive, they must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. Next slide, please. I'll be quick. You also have intersectional provision on intersectional discrimination, which is also very important. Also, there is no reporting obligation on such discrimination, but it's a first step. You have a provision on the need to workers with disabilities, and also the fact that all vacancy notice and all job titles must be gender neutral, which is also something very new. Next slide, please. So, next slide, sorry. Yes, they apply to companies which more than 250 employees. Annual report as of 2027. For for medium-sized company, it's also it's start also in 2027 and it takes place every 3 years. Smaller companies have a bit of a delay until 2031, and small companies less than 100 employees, I don't have any reporting obligation, but as the directive, it set minimum standards, so member states can decide to impose obligation on them, but it's their decision. It's not in the directive. Next slide, please. So here you have information. Article 9 gives information about what kind of information employers must report to member states. So as you can see, it's very comprehensive. You have seven type of information. The management must check it, and the workers' representative must be consulted. Which is very important as well, is that information must be publicly available and on the website of the company, and the monitoring body, which is a public authority in charge of monitoring the application of the directive, will also receive the info and publish them. Next slide, please. So in case a problem is identified, a pay gap more than 5%, which cannot be justified, and the employer has not taken any remedy measure, then there is a joint pay assessment, which is carried out in close cooperation with workers' representative. It aims to identify, remedy, and prevent this problem. Again, workers' representative play a key role, and there is an obligation for employers to solve the issue within a reasonable period of time, which is not specified, and it's a kind of mediation solution to find a way to solve the issue in an amicable way. Next and last slide. Yes. Last slide, please. Yes. So this directive is expected to raise awareness on this gender bias and gender discrimination when hiring people or during their work life, and they aim to help the employers to solve them in close cooperation with worker representative, and it also helps the individual workers to seek redress in a legal way when the situation is not properly solved for them. Voilà. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you so much. It's been very valuable, and we've seen comments from participants that this is very relevant to them. So thank you both for this very insightful presentation. We have a few questions that have come in, but let's go over to Alyson. And Alyson, this is also something that preoccupies you on a daily basis with reporting and the nature of S&P, but also in your own work. So if you could tell us a little bit about what S&P Global does and how corporate social responsibility, diversity, equity, inclusion are being addressed at S&P Global. Over to you, Alyson.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me. So S&P Global is a financial services and data and analytics organization, most broadly. many folks know us through our indices, such as the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. We also have we have 5 divisions that I won't go into now. S&P Global Ratings is also where many folks intersect with us through our we're the world's largest rating organization. We have been reporting on corporate responsibility, providing an impact report or ESG report, depending on the company terminology. We've done that for more than 12 years now. We're finishing up our report that will be published in early May, fingers crossed. We also, what I think is special about S&P, just very quickly, we have about 40,000 employees in about 40 plus countries around the world. We are based in New York. However, we do have employees based throughout Europe as well as APAC, and a large percentage of our employees are based in Pakistan and India. So we truly are a global organization, and so we need to think about things like gender. We need to think about things like intersectionality and equity using a global lens, but also honoring and respecting the local cultures and nuances and regulations that are happening in country or even regional levels. So I consider it an asset for us. The corporate responsibility team that I lead is co-located with the diversity, equity, and inclusion team. So we are oftentimes, you see these silos of activity happening, whereas we have quite deliberately, both the DEI team and the CR team report up into the Chief Responsibility and Diversity Officer, and which is it's a executive level position within the company. And so that allows us to think more holistically and about some of the things that we just heard about, which is on intersectionality of issues, how climate work impacts gender work, how we think about disclosure from the broad level. We now have a DEI specific report, and our second one, where we can really take a deep dive into our impacts and risks and opportunities on as it relates to through our DEI work. So I think that context is helpful for this audience. So hopefully that was sufficient.
Yes, thank you, Alyson. So maybe you could go a little bit deeper into how the EU reporting regulations that we heard about today is impacting you on gender equality. And if you could talk a little bit about your own reporting process.
Sure. So like I said, we've reported for many, many years, and we've reported on gender equity, pay gap, and so forth, our board diversity for some time. And I won't, in the interest of time, I'll let folks find that on, which is available publicly on our website, going back as long as we've had them. I think what's interesting about the EU regulation is what Andreea and Elodie talked about, which is that even non-EU based organizations can be subject to the regulation if they're based on their size and their scope and their revenue within EU borders. However, even taking a step back from that, we are a complex international organization. We have lots of legal entities, and so we're still going through the process of determining our whether or not jurisdictionally we are affected by the EU regulation. We also know that the EU countries are still transposing the laws into the local. So depending on our revenue levels and our employee base, we're still trying to figure that out. All that being said, we're still moving forward as though we are subject to the EU regulation because our customers will be. And when we think about that, it's a full value chain disclosure for EU-based companies, for companies that are, so they need to look upstream in their products and services and end of life and all of that and their investments, but then they also need to look downstream into their their supply chain. We are B2B, so we are in the supply chain. So whether it's this regulation, or whether it's the German Supply Chain Act, or whether it's other regulations that are happening around the world, if our customers need that information from us, we still need to be able to answer these questions. So I'd encourage companies who are on the conversation today to think about it both. Yes, we do need to figure out if we are regulated, if we fall under this regulation, but we also need to take a step back and look at the larger ecosystem and see what the EU regulation is going to kind of raise the tide on expectations for companies on their disclosures in this space.
Great, thank you for that. And is there anything that you'd like to add on how you specifically are responding to this requirement at this point? You said that you are responding as if you are compliant, but anything else that you'd like to add on that? And
Sure.
why should companies, even though they're not compliant to the regulations, why should they care?
Well, I think, you know, and it was discussed briefly earlier that if there's a lot of complexity in the regulation, it's super overwhelming, right? And we've done a gap analysis and looking at our current reporting versus where we need to be, and but just even taking S&P out of it, there's something like well over 1,000 KPIs that are, if you look across the EU regulation, and key performance indicators or sets of data. But what's interesting about this regulation is it not only wants the information, it doesn't just want the data point, it also wants to know who's responsible for managing it, the strategy, and the governance model of the information. And so that is also, I think, opening up new conversations within companies around how do we not just talk about, it's not just about you know, the ratio of men to women on any particular topic, it's also how that's being managed and what the strategy is for a go forward plan. And so the for organizations to think kind of holistically about these topics is going to be very interesting. It will, I think, open many conversations between suppliers and customers, between companies and who they choose to do business with. The other piece is for perfection not to be the enemy of the good, and the goal is for companies to get on the journey of this. And we have, as a non-EU based organization, we have the luxury of watching our EU peers and counterparts go through this first. And so we can learn about, and we're just now starting to see the first EU based companies come out with CSRD, quote unquote, compliant or aligned reports. The other thing I think for companies to think about, and we didn't really get into it today, is that we're all learning together, right? So we're talking to consultants and we're talking internally, we're talking to our peer companies, but there's no kind of model for what good looks like. So we're going to have to co-create that together as a business community. And the concept of materiality is quite important here. And so companies will do not have to report on all 1,000 plus KPIs across. They're being asked to go through a robust materiality process. And the interesting piece will be if companies determine that through the process of materiality, if gender and human rights lens falls within the material topic, because it needs to be looked at through the lens of impact on the whether it's the environment or the person, as well as the risk to the company and the opportunity to the company. And so it's probably a topic for another webinar on another day. But I noticed that there was one question on, you know, are we so if someone, say on a board of directors, identifies as non-binary, should that person be reported? And I would imagine the approach that we take now is we report on individuals in our employee base who, so when we look at gender breakdowns, we include a category for non-binary, or we also include a category for chooses not to say, because not everybody wants to disclose their gender. And so it's not quite around, it's, yes, we want to know the women to men and we want to know those, but it's really less about the number per se, but more around the transparency and giving that information out to our stakeholders, and for them to then respond and have the information that they need to work with us.
Great, thank you, Alyson. And I think that that's also what we see and with our broader WEPs community, that transparency is more important than, not to say that progress is not important, but it's more important to show where you are, and so you can show where you're heading rather than the result itself. So thanks for elaborating a little bit more on that. And thanks also for taking one of the questions from one of the participants. So we will continue with a few more questions. There are actually a few coming in. Elodie, you wanted to say something before we go into the Q&A?
Yeah, just coming back to this question of the board, board member, non-binary board member. While we were discussing, I was checking quickly the wording of the Women on Board Directive, and they talk about the underrepresented sex. So they don't really mention non-binary people, but as you know, the European legislation is regularly reviewed, and we can see a trend in the European legislation to include more and more non-binary people. So when there will be the review of the directive, it's totally possible that this is addressed later on.
Great. So I'm going to go through a few questions, and then you can answer Elodie or Andreea or Alyson, and then we'll take another round, because I think we now have a number of them. But the first one is about, it's from Dana. She's asking if she understood correctly that the CSRD applies to the value and supply chain. Does the Pay Transparency Directive also apply to the value and supply chain? Meaning, are you tracking the pay transparency from suppliers as well? So that's the first question. Also on the Pay Transparency Directive obligations, besides publishing on the company website, should the report be sent to authority? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about the reporting process. And these authorities receive the report, will then be determined by the member states. Another one is also on the equal pay transparency. So I will continue with one more question. I can see that the Equal Pay Transparency Directive requires companies to publish their mean and median pay gap. This is maybe a little bit technical, but regarding the methodology to use, do they have to calculate the adjusted or the unadjusted pay gap? So I don't know if you have an answer to this right away. If you do, please answer. Otherwise, there's maybe something we can investigate and share later. So those are the questions for now, and then more are coming in. So
yes, so we are also checking while we were discussing about the questions, and Andreea, who is a lawyer, can confirm that the Pay Transparency Directive does not apply to the value and supply chain. So it applies only to the company. It's in the scope, Article 2 of the directive. Regarding the reporting, Ugo's question, actually, yes, you have a very comprehensive and complex reporting process. So first, the employer must report to member states 7 type of information, and it will also reply to Desideria's question. One of the information provided to member states is about adjusted gender pay gap. So you have information provided by employers to member states about the general gender pay gap, and you have also information about the adjusted gender pay gap, so by category of workers. So they report 2. So then once it's reported to member states are obliged by this directive to designate monitoring bodies. It can be whatever they like, it can be a ministry, an agency, whatever. This is the liberty given by the directive, but they have to appoint a so-called monitoring body. This monitoring body is compiling information received by employers. It's making them available, I think, on their website, and then they're also reporting back to the European Commission. It will, so it's Article 29 on the directive, which is a reporting obligation to member states. You know, when I presented one of my first slides, I said that CSRD and Pay Transparency are two directives which put obligation on both employers and member states, reporting obligations to both employers and member states. So employers are supposed to report information to member states, monitoring authority, and this monitoring authority are then supposed to provide the European Commission with information. Then the European Commission will monitor the evolution, because as I said also earlier, the European Commission is revising periodically its legislation, and for that they need data. They need to see if the situation has been improving thanks to the legislation, or if there are still problems. The next review for the Pay Transparency Directive is in June 2031, and it's under Article 35 of the directive. And then, so it will be a review carried out by the Commission on the basis of information provided by member states. And then the Commission, after carrying out this in-depth review, will report back to the European Parliament and to the Council by June 2033. So in basically 9 years, we will have a review of the impact of this directive on the gender pay gap. Yes, indeed.
Anything to add from you, Alyson, on this point on pay transparency in general? No. So then I will continue with a question from Gabriella. What happens after reporting? Is there any regulatory sanctions?
Yeah.
We also have another question. They wonder what's the linkage between EU directives and WTO agreements.
On the, first of all, let's start with the easiest one, where I personally don't know for sure on the connection with the the directives and the WTO agreements. I have to admit that I do not know. I can search and then maybe get back to you via an email, but on the top of my head, I do not know. On the other question related to what's happening after the reporting and sanctions, out of what I have been able to find out, well, first of all, there is this principle which we already mentioned, that the directive needs to be transposed at national level. So actually, each member state has to transpose that into legislation, and then also to come up with sanctions. Generally, so each national legislation and sanctions would apply. On the other hand, with respect to the company, then if there is damage created, liability would be involved. More than that, I would have to go a bit deeper, because yeah, it's a new instrument for us as well here.
So there's no effort at the EU level to identify sanction. It's up to each member state.
The EU level can only give some margins, but it's up to the national state to decide. The EU level, the Commission can give a threshold or the higher threshold, and then the member states. But again, I did not check exactly the details on that, because actually it should be kept in mind that the CSRD amends 4 other instruments. So it's actually going to each and every one of those and see how it is affected and what is applicable in each instance. There was a question about reporting, so they have to be the report. It's included in the management report. it has to be online, it has to be, and eventually it has to be integrated into I have the name, into a European database, but also each member state have the obligation to gather data and give it to the Commission, because actually the Commission has to do an evaluation of the implementation of the instrument, of the directive, because usually in 3 years' time there is a big exercise of evaluation, revision if needed, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So the person who had asked about the link with WTO would appreciate an answer on this, and I think we're all curious. So maybe that's something we can share with everyone. There was also a question about the applicability. Does it also relate to NGOs and non-commercial entities, including government agencies? With this regulation, but I'll take, because we're running out of time, so I'm going to grab a few other questions. And another one is about the methodology to use to calculate the gender gap. So, I mean, the gender gap has so many different dimensions, and I shared at the beginning how we have proposed to the indicators we have proposed for the web signatories. But also I have posted in the chat 2 resources with indicators, but also the ones that we're asking you to report on, the methodology behind that. But I'm now with the new EU legislation and also the work of S&P, I think we need to make sure that this is also coherent across the board. So I'd like to hear maybe a little bit from you, Alyson and Elodie and Andreea. How do you come up with the terminology around collecting data against this indicator to make sure that it's coherent and consistent across? And there's also a question on, once you identify this, I mean, we talked a little bit about the sanctions, but what are support to the victims of discrimination? Is there a mechanism being developed for that? And then there's a long question here. Let me just see, and that's the last one. So I think with that we will end afterwards, and then you could also add any other points that you would like to make. But for companies that are based in less developed countries, will there be a focus on reporting and setting target versus comparability to more developed countries? So will you treat all of the companies that are operating in the EU on an equal basis, or will there be a distinction whether they're in least developed countries? I know EU has been working a lot on least developed countries, so maybe there's some form of differentiation there. Are those directives negotiated with ministries of investment and trade of the exporting companies? How are you encouraging compliance so it becomes voluntary and not just done for the box checking, so that there's a buy-in to this whole process and not just feeling that it's an obligation? How do you work on getting that buy-in? And companies need to be incentivized and provisions and given kind of tools and training, et cetera, et cetera. So anything that you're dealing with either from S&P side or at the broader global level on around ensuring a buy-in and compliance and that it's not a box ticking exercise or anything from EU. But let's start with Alyson, and then we go to Elodie and Andreea, and then if Alyson also, and if you want to add some additional things that you have forgotten, and then I think we'll wrap up for today.
So, you know, there's a lot packed in what you just were talking about. And I think it speaks to the fact that we are all, this is an evolutionary process, and we want to do better today than we did yesterday. And I'm sure it will not be good enough for what tomorrow's expectations will be. And so we come into our disclosures and our reporting with that mindset and that level of humility, and that we're learning, which is part of the value and transparency, right? So we can have better conversations with our stakeholders. We have more trusted conversations, which is, again, we can get really lost in the minutia, but if we take a step back to think about what the point of transparency is to really come in as learners. And that's what we do in all of our disclosures, as well as in gender. So right now we disclose a pay gap as well as a bonus pay gap because of our because that has been, as a commercial organization with employees who are some employees who are commissioned and bonused, that has that shows will likely evolve that over time, both because of regulation as well as our own learning. And so I can't speak to what the future will look like, but I'm sure that will be evolving over time. And we welcome these conversations. We're having them both internally with our employees as well as with our external stakeholders. And I apologize, there was a lot packed into the question that you posed. So if there's another piece that you want me to tease out, I'm happy to do that.
Great. No, thank you, Alyson. We only have a few minutes, 3 minutes left. So I think I'll give Elodie and Andreea a chance to also respond to those last questions. But thank you so much.
Sure.
Yes, for the gender pay gap, actually at European level, it's Eurostat or statistical office that is in charge of calculating the gender pay gap for each country, and then at the EU level. Spontaneously, for the raw gender pay gap, I would say that you have to calculate the difference between men and women's salaries, including bonuses. In the directive on pay transparency, you have indeed to have the raw gender pay gap, but also for the fixed salary, but also for the bonuses, and also, which is also very important for some of you, the adjusted by work category. I can provide Miha with more information on the calculation method, no problem for me, but spontaneously, this is my reply. As regards the next question about support to victims, for the pay transparency, as we saw, there is a first step. When there is a problem identified at the level of a company with more than 5% gender pay gap. There is a first step, which is joint pay assessment, which is designed to help the employers to address and to solve the issue, and with the help of workers' representatives. So there is this kind of mediation way to solve the issue. And on the other hand, you have individual right for victims to seek justice. I'm not sure there is a specific kind of support to them, but in the directive, they are entitled the right to get justice, and pay discrimination is criminalized under this directive, meaning that you have a specific provisions on which are the sanctions for companies that breach this directive. For companies that based in less developed countries. So we are here talking about countries that companies that operate in Europe. So in Europe, you have indeed different level of economical development, but the obligations are the same as the same everywhere in the European territories. That's the basic principle. However, as you could see in the presentation, the smaller companies get support. So they get more time to adapt, and they get also, and this is in the directive. Let me just check where.
So just a question, because I think there was a lot of questions around trade. And so those are, let's say somebody is based outside the EU and they're exporting to the EU, they're not falling under this legislation. It's only if they have operations in the country. Is that correct?
Well, in case they have employees paid in the EU territory, and they have more than 100, they fall under the but imagine you are an African company and you have 2 employees in France, then you are not obliged to report. But even if you are a third country company and you operate in European territory with more than 100 employees, you are obliged to report. Just to mention that for smaller companies, Article 11 says that technical assistance and training must be provided, meaning that, as is usually the case in the European Union legislation, smaller companies get some help, some assistance from the European Union to comply with legislation, because it is, of course, a bit difficult for them.
And very quickly, if I may, to try to reply as to how it's calculated, at least under the standards that we have been talking about. So they say the gender pay gap defined as the difference of average pay levels between female and male employees expressed as percentage of the average pay level of male employees. And then there is a note explaining a bit even further. And then if you want, I can also explain the annual total remuneration ratio, the highest paid individual to the median annual total remuneration for all employees, excluding the highest paid individual. So I really encourage everybody to go check the standards. All the information is available. It's pretty comprehensive. And I can understand that it might feel a bit complicated in the beginning, but it's pretty well explained. It remains to be seen, of course, how it's going to be in practice. From everybody just starts now, but we can provide also this information in writing to Mira. No problem.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
And the reply to GADA, indeed, it's the company is only responsible for reporting on their operation inside European Union. Yes, if there are more than 100 employees there in the European Union.
Very good. So there's a lot of questions coming in, and we'll see if there is something that we can share with you. What we normally do, there has been questions about that too. We'll share the recording so that you can go back to some of the slides and some of the conversations that we had and remind yourself. But in the meantime, I think we're also preparing a summary, and somebody asked if we are doing an executive summary. Yes, we will. We have Nicole here on the call, and she will help us with that. But any links that you have of resources that you think could be helpful, please do share them with us, and we will include them in that blog article. And anything else that you'd like to share, both Alyson, Elodie, and Andreea, to provide additional information, we'll put that on our website. So everybody has been super excited to be here today, as we are. I think your contributions, Alyson, Elodie, Andreea, have been fantastic from different perspectives. And I think this is just the beginning. I see there's so much interest in these questions. So I think we'll probably, and also Alyson, you suggested that we might have to have a separate conversation on some of the topics that you raised. So thank you so much. And I think, Miwa, do we have a survey? So I'll hand it back over to you, Miwa.
Perfect.
To close us off.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all the panelists. Yes,